Have a gosh dang beaver darn great damn day.
The Great Beaver Fiasco. We are back with our special guest, Michael Belongie. And if you're watching this right now, you know that we are on YouTube under Supper Club Media. And if you're listening, we are on Podbean and Spotify. You can also like and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Michael, thank you so much for joining us here in the month of April, which is National Poetry Month.
Yes, it is. And sometimes it's noted that April is the cruelest month. And because there are ideal spring blooming suns, and then there is the bitter not yet.
The bitter not yet.
Not yet.
The bitter not yet. Well, we have a lot of things that are yet to come here in the program. In a little bit, we are going to be reading some of the works of Michael Belongie's favorite poets. We're also going to be hearing some of Michael's own poetry here in observance of National Poetry Month. But first, Michael, we want to kind of zero in on this idea of poetry here as we kick this first segment off, and maybe just simply ask you, what is poetry and why is it important?
I would begin with Emily Dickinson, a very powerful few-word poem, A Word. A word is dead when it is said, some say. I say it just begins to live that day.
What does it mean to you, that poem?
It is, I think, the modern moment that Emily Dickinson was able to cite that the efficiency in words is the power. As in music, oftentimes rest, pauses, silence affect great movements in a piece of music. And poetry is definitely one of the arts.
When we were setting up before we started recording, you were kind of jokingly making a comparison between poetics and poetry, and you seemed much more enthralled about talking about poetics than poetry. How are the two words different to you?
Poetry is a classification that is more a bureaucratic cataloging. Poetics, I believe, is the human reception of spontaneous feelings.
I find it interesting that in the month of April, we had a solar eclipse that was once in a generation. The next time we might see this is in 2070. What do you think is the significance of a celestial event like that happening during National Poetry Month? Does that have a special meaning for you?
Your insightfulness has a special meaning because I did not think of this, but if we go back to Stonehenge, all what we call prehistoric indigenous peoples, at one time indigenous peoples are all the peoples of the world because we all have a start point as an identity of a family, clans, eventually larger tribes. So the idea of washing the celestial bodies give them a opportunity to plant crops, to hunt in understanding when the most effective hunting would be done, not decimating reproduction of these food sources for them. And I believe that this solar event has an opportunity to say we are just a click of a pencil on a table when we talk about the billions of years of our cosmic evolution. So this particular point where we had so many people gathering at the optimum geographical point to experience this event returns us again to the very important values that indigenous peoples better understood than we have in our distracted technology world.
I can understand what you're saying with that, but too, I didn't even make the connection either, Thomas, about the eclipse, but it's very synchronistic, I guess, because I feel poetry, and I'm sure I'm not alone, obviously brings people together. It makes you not feel so alone. Anyway, for me. And with the eclipse, it brought so many people together, and you kind of put your differences aside maybe and came together and didn't feel alone.
I think going back to what you said about poems and poetry or poetics, poetics is an action. I guess nature is the first teacher of poetry, and the celestial events would have been the first way. That would have been the first rituals that I guess proto-humans would have had. We wouldn't have had language or culture, and it would have been gathering together to see these events occurring, a meteor shower, the sun rising, an eclipse happening. That would have been the first communion of watching the universe and experiencing it together. And that would have been probably the very first poems we would have had, is about the world that we're seeing together.
Yes, and in the prehistoric French caves, a friend and author, Gary Meyer, has done a close examination of several of those caves. The question is, so how did these people enter these caves? How did they illuminate them? What do they mean in that they already are starting to see there was almost a Morse code at part of some of the art representations, and that we underestimate the amazing resiliency of the human race. So if we're talking 4,000 years ago, what would lead these indigenous people to enter the caves, to offer significant art, which for 4,000 years has not seen any other observers of that artwork. It's an art gallery, is what it is.
Michael, you mentioned earlier that you mentioned the efficiency of poetry. Is all good poetry succinct? Is all good poetry concise? Is there room in the world for overly flowery, long, endlessly long poetry?
In the tragedy Hamlet has a line that he delivers, words, words, words. And it's a matter of this cliche that when we waste these words to be underhanded, duplicitous, it is doing an injustice to the gift of our language. Language is what has brought us to this level of optimum communications. Our genetically, very carefully, 98, 99% primate ancestors already have been determined to have a language, and they can recognize possibly several hundred words that they can officiate. And that is another significant lesson for us. All creaturehood is connected. This idea of a primacy that Homo sapiens has is certainly misdirected. All creation, all of our cells in the body re-energize and replace themselves every 7 years. So that's a big question. What happens if all these cells are being replaced? Is the same person there? Well, only a sentient person can even ask that kind of question. So that's our particular obligation, to use that intelligence in a fashion that is supportive and assisting all creation.
There is a danger with language because language has this tendency of creating an ego of you now have this amazing power to create and shape and express your thoughts as a person. And while that's great, but everyone wants to keep filling in the empty space with their impression, keep using words. How is that art of poetics, how is that useful in whittling down that ego while respecting the power of language?
Some of my more mature poetry has evolved to being self-effacing of our smugness. That I had a poem that a person said, "You must be a marvel to live with. You're so enriching." And I did an entire poem on this. Yeah, I can prettify words. But I also can use them as weapons, and that is not very attractive. So that is a point well made.
Well, I think to quote Heidegger, didn't he say language is the house of being?
Yes, he did.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of houses of being, under this question of what is poetry, maybe the flip side, what is not poetry? Michael, are there modern art pieces that you feel don't fit the definition, whether it be a classic definition or a revised definition of what poetry is? Is L.A. Bass's favorite music from Prince or Sting? Is that poetry?
It is, and it is a poetry that has a more comprehensive, inclusive audience. I think that oftentimes poetics are more gently received. When we talk about poetry, it's very prescriptive. I just judged a poetry contest, and I was immediately, there were a K through 12 school district, and it's apparent that there is a great deal of work to do with providing opportunity to be playful. You need more teachers that say, we don't need coloring books. We need to have as much of the art world in schools, secondary, allows much more opportunity to explore shape, form, and applications to that art. And I think the same needs to be done in the classroom, that this is poetry, and then have a particular music popular to that age group that they're listening to right now. It's poetry. And if there are people that are trying to constrain what poetry is, they are doing it a disservice to the art. It should be wide open.
The idea of art in general should be wide open, which reminds me of a collaboration that you've had recently with the artists over at the Dodge County Center for the Arts, in collaboration with another fine art institution here in the Beaver Dam area, the Beaver Dam Area Community Theater. Can you tell me a little bit about how you were involved with their latest play?
The Dodge County Center for the Arts has initiated a more transparent bond that with the building that is now the Beaver Dam Area Theater and the Dodge County Center for the Arts, it is really an art, what I call, it's a local art square. That's what I'm going to call it.
I think that, isn't it designated as an art district now?
Right. It should be an art district because there is, with the location of the Dodge County Center for the Arts, an opportunity in a new setting to be so approximate to the grand focus and stunning theater. I had a Green Bay friend, artist, poet, author, say he was just amazed at over 100+ productions in a community theater with such variety. He said that does not happen.
Mm-hmm.
And to hear that is saying that that's true. Since moving to Beaver Dam in 1970, it was right from the start. I came from Oshkosh, and they had a good active community theater, and I thought all cities had that. That's not the case.
Surprise.
Yes.
The play was centered thematically on the Dust Bowl. How was your poetry part of this presentation of the Dust Bowl, and what is your connection to this period in American history in the early part of the 1900s that saw record issues with the economy and with being able to keep food on the table? Where does the Michael Belongie fit into that story?
As they offered, this would be the Beaver Dam Area Community Theater, and the DCCA offered an opportunity for people to provide artifacts of this Dust Bowl period, like Depression glass, and there was a person that brought some to be seen, and they said, what's this? So many younger people, what is this Depression glass? And then what about clothes made from flour sacks? What about scraps of leftover sewing materials made into the warmth of blankets that were very in short supply, because everything was in short supply in these needy times. So much migration. And in that process, I recalled a poem that I had written about my father's particular Dust Bowl experience, and I thought, well, that one should be shared. So I shared that with Amy at the DCCA, and Amy McPherson said, I love that poem, but I really would like to have your backstory. You told it so well. So I went back to the writing desk and provided a backstory of that poem. And so that poem I will read the backstory of. They provided in a free print on good stock heavy paper the backstory and the poem. And I would call the poem is a family narrative, and it's and it's an oral family history that sometimes you need to listen more carefully. There's significant truth in oral families stories. So here is the backstory. I call it the story poem. And my father's name was Cyril, and he went by the name Cy Belongie.
Mm-hmm.
His birth was 1914, and he passed at age 86 in 1999. Cy graduated from Daggett High School, Upper Michigan, in 1934. At age 19, with no prospect for employment, Dad hopped a boxcar. Destination, West Coast, sort of. He recounted to his 4 sons and 3 daughters that a hobo life was desperate and dangerous, and a $5 bill on you could mean you being rolled off that fast-motion boxcar. Just out of a chapter of Grapes of Wrath, for a healthy 19-year-old, migrant fruit picking added up to barely enough for food. In that setting, with a capital THAT, setting of diminishing returns, Cy did his practical math, enlisted with the United States Army in California, and finished his enlistment in early 1936. A good card player, he paid out for his early enlistment that year. His widowed mother, Rose, and entire family, 4 brothers and a sister, also relocated to California permanently. Another chapter. In 1939, Sergeant Belongie was redrafted for the remainder of World War II, and as a seasoned veteran, as a sergeant those years, 1939 to 1945, he attained First Master Sergeant rank, awarded 4 campaign medals and 2 Bronze Stars. Ancestries of Quebec, within Quebec, has been completed for the Belongie Leblanc by his granddaughter, Lindley Liss, Ph.D. His mother, Rose Cecile Leblanc lineage, 1507, traces that her 11th grandfather was Chief Henri Sachem Chima, who lived from 1507 to 1611, of Nova Scotia, legendary, aged 104 years old.
Wow.
Family stories, Belongie Leblanc, need to be accorded some credibility. Niece Lindley reconnected that 4th century resiliency. So here's the poem. Bootlegger in a small Michigan town. A dog sled brought French-Canadian great-great-grandpère on a visit to his son. Jack London Odyssey, twice traveled in winter. The surname Belanger, anglicized to Belongie, affixed to his son's will to be American. 5th generation recipes for tete fromage and Christmas Eve pork pies hearken that past. A silence, as whole as the Canadian wild, has engulfed the present. Snippets from my father are narrated, bootlegging of Philip and evading revenue men in the candy storefront. Stout and muscled, my father eluded the law, bottles nestled in a heavy coat. Hero son, father's advocate, took to the rails to California. Adventure in the blood. Steinbeck's migrant days unfolded. Absent son must mourn grandfather's death apart. And I am drawn in winter back to that wilderness of great-great-grandpère. Wily determination on his treks holds family myth. That strong voice beckons his dogs. I hear its crackling cadence, reverberating over the virgin snows. That man and sled pack destinies.
Destinies. When you think about the destiny of your father and your family's sojourn out west, what do you think about? What comes to mind? The poem to me seems to have this, underlying sense of coincidence about it. What if the Belongie family never went out west? What if your dad never hopped on that box car? What was your thought process as you put pen to paper with that?
It continues to have movement. At present, I am more in awe than I've ever been. This very oftentimes published Green Bay friend said, after reading that poem, he said, Cy was a hero. And I'm thinking, he certainly was. There was one other particular time in his life in the military that I thought was remarkable. So he is now doing his second draft enlistment, and he is in Fort Sheridan, Illinois, and here he is, Cy Belongie, and he's from a small upper Michigan town, and they have a segregated army, and they ask for training sergeants to volunteer to train all black troops. And it's remarkable that my father had no qualms. Of course, I'm going to train men for the necessary duty for World War II. And it became a family standard of what was expected of us. So I have a deceased brother that is Army Reserve officer. I was an Army Reserve medic. And I have a brother that is a retired Marine colonel. And a good part of his professional life, the last 10 years of his career, was focused with equity within the armed services, with the Navy and the Marines having the first required equity for all NCOs and officers. And I thought Dad's fine sense of the standards of decency continued that following generation. So I'm very pleased with that, Brother Raymond Belongie.
So it seems like the destiny of your father, I guess I kind of get torn up of asking when it deals, when life has all these coincidences, why is it important to ask all these what if questions? Because there is no end to them. What if this happened? What if this didn't happen? Why is that an important exercise, and why is the art of poetics so specialized in kind of breaking down what really can be an infinite water wheel of asking questions and not getting anywhere?
Yes. Let's come up with the word conundrum, but I think it's a conundrum that needs to be reiterated over and over again. We are so presumptive that we have an American ethic, like I came up from my bootstraps, and if only other people would have worked as hard as I did. Well, some of these people, had they worked just as hard as you had, did not have the problem of having a very color-sensitive society. And every person that is in the melting pot of the United States, sometimes it's pretty scalding water you're put into. They want you to change your language, your culture, this ethic that you're here on these shores because there was no other option other than facing a fire squad or going into a conscripted army with no chance of survival. So we oftentimes have that connection with so many immigrants that there was serious changes in those people's lives coming here. A new language had to be learned. a sense of what their priorities were. Let's say if it's a whole different cultural focus, you're a Muslim, and that particular dilemma that all nationalities, all cultures have a common good. They survive because they learn that they have to cooperate. And that is hopefully the next chapter with the world. We need to be inclusive. We cannot survive this earth without cooperation.
And I can see with the oral history that you have shared with your father and the stories about the Dust Bowl, that is bringing in inclusion. It's bringing in other people to share in your family's stories. And yet I don't feel that many people, at least in my generation, are sharing their stories or thinking that the stories that they're experiencing today need to be shared. It seems that as we get older, we only... that the past kind of shines a little bit brighter of what lessons could have been learned, but by the time we realize it's too late to put the pen to paper and get all the details out.
I have a great empathy for the generations that are presently dealing with grade school, secondary, adults entering into the work world. Your particular slope is so much more steeped than mine was, and I believe that there's been a significant baby boom era, and I believe that there's a lost recognition of how significant your contributions are. So those grade school and high school students, young adults, college graduates, they all have a much larger price of continuing to have the much longer living baby boom generation here, and oftentimes they don't meet the economic and social levels that their parents already believe are theirs just for the purpose of being here. And I certainly am not satisfied with that lack of gratitude that I don't see enough times. When I see veterans, I am a veteran, and when I have the national focus on veterans and the prices they've paid in the mental issues of being in a war-torn country and facing such traumas, that we need to understand this is a grand sacrifice, and we need to support all of us, because we're in this together.
Michael, are you seeing? Do you feel that that younger generations are embracing poetry the way it had for earlier generations?
Myself, I had particular teachers that simply had such a connection to poetry that they were able to inculcate, to give me a sense of this is significant to read poetry and to create poetry and to work with others. That's so necessary for other poets to continue. They need coaching, and that is something that I think teachers have some ambivalence whether they can be that guide. But I believe so many teachers that I experienced, fine teachers, have that ability, and it's right coming out of their mouth. They're poetic in the way they coach us. So
well, I think there's no fame or stardom I think, for younger people to see if you become a poet. I mean, you don't really see poetry books on any bestseller lists. And I think that, maybe the realization isn't there that actually lyrics can be poetry.
Yes, and Laura, you should explain this. I was enriched with your favorite songwriter at present. So why don't you talk about that a bit?
Oh, Sufjan Stevens?
Yes.
Did you?
I've listened to many of his songs now, and
Okay.
I understand the cadence, and I understand his artistic demeanor. He is very artful. Some of these songs that it works with a beat and it continues word after word after word. Okay, he's not that way. He is a soulful songwriter.
And actually, sometimes more so than I can understand, and I have to have my oldest daughter explain it to me because she gets that. She's a poet. She's a writer. And I think, there are many times where his lyrics just, as I was saying earlier, they make you feel like you aren't alone. Because I feel that way quite often. And so you just listen to his music, and his lyrics are just so straightforward and
vulnerable.
Yeah.
He's so open, and that to me is artfulness, is to be open. And as I was saying earlier in our conversations, this idea of being self-effacing, that's oftentimes what people find attractive with a soulmate. Is that you can be vulnerable. It's okay. You don't have to be all the answer person.
We should expand on that at some point, because I still haven't found my soulmate, as everyone knows. So we need to investigate that. But you're right. I mean, as far as exposing himself, it then brings you together. It makes the world not so terrible at times. And it can be at times.
It's hopeful. It's hopeful that we live in this very deluded idea about love. I did a Tina Turner concert on Tuesday. What's love got to do with it? And I said, look at her first husband. It had to do with terrible abuse. Yeah. And it's a matter of having the ability simply to say, I'm beautiful on my own merits.
That's true. And I guess, too, and when we talk about synchronicity or flukes, I mean, if she wouldn't have experienced that terrible relationship, would she have been as much of a strong performer, lyricist? I can't say it. Lyricist, yes. Or really a poet.
Her backstory, as she did meet the man of completion in her life, the life story is that 2 of her 4 children, she had 4 children with Ike. That is just, to me, stultifying. I mean, I just like it, really. And then to have in her lifetime 2, one proceed with cancer and the other with suicide. It is like we all have our journeys, and pain and suffering is simply going to be a part of it.
Sufjan Stevens is one of LA's favorite lyricists, poets, if you will. As we wind this segment down, Michael, are there songwriters, are there poets that you might recommend to some of our viewers or listeners here at the Great Beaver Fiasco?
Well, the first person, just because she is a Wisconsin native, is Lorene Niedecker, who lived her life near Fort Atkinson on Black Hawk Island. That to me is a significant touchstone that we're in the midst of an amazing scenic state of multiple possibilities. And then another one of my late and great finds has been Robert Lax, the poet, a classmate at Columbia College with Thomas Merton, the famous Trappist and contemplative author of 20 books. And his gift to me has been the need for quiet and for reflection by more abstract use of words. I think he also had a very significant modern contemporary artist, Reinhardt, who was co-artisting in abstract art and is an international star of note in the abstract world of art.
And we're going to hear some of those pieces along with some of Michael's pieces and some timeless favorites on part 2 of our conversation with Beaver Dam poet Michael Belongie. You're listening to the Great Beaver Fiasco. We ask that you please subscribe to us on our YouTube channel. Check us out on Facebook at the Great Beaver Fiasco.
Beautifully said, Greg.
I second that.
We need to end the show, though, before we start part 2.
How you subscribe for those.
Well, the best way to subscribe is to look for that thumbs up on YouTube and click on it. You'll get notifications whenever we have new exciting guests.
It's a bell, right?
Is it a bell?
You can like the video, but then you want to ring that bell because every time we publish an episode, that's going to ring your notification box.
Actually, you have to hit the subscribe button.
Okay, so we've got 3 theories here as to how one would become a subscriber. You know what? Why don't you subscribe and you tell us how you did it?
Please.
And we'll be looking forward to
you subscribe in your heart first and then subscribe on YouTube.
The Great Beaver Fiasco is the name of the podcast. The YouTube channel is Supper Club Media. The guest here is Michael Belongie, local poet. We so thank him for his time in this first segment, and we are so looking forward to hearing more from Michael in part 2 of this conversation here on
The Great Beaver Fiasco.
That's what everybody was waiting for. That's why it didn't feel like it was over, right?
That had a good flow.
Beaver Dam, Wisconsin's got peppers and a stage. Beaver Dam, Kentucky's where Bill Monroe first played. Beaver Dam, anywhere the people all say, have a gosh dang beaver darn great damn day.
The bitter mod chat.
Not yet.